welcome to my channel. I'm Madison, and today I am very excited to present to you the first episode in my new series, Fashion Archaeology. In this series, you will learn about the everyday fashion of different time periods throughout history. In today's episode, we will be delving deep into the past and uncovering the real fashion of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians were very conscious and particular about cleanliness and their appearance. Lack of appropriate dress reflected on that person's character, and they were considered inferior. This inferiority stemmed from not only being an insult to the people around you, but it was also considered an insult to the supposed gods of the day. Since the beginning of time, clothing has been closely connected with social status, social standards, and self-expression. In ancient times, your clothing would indicate not only your wealth, but your occupation, whether you were a freeman or a slave, your religion, marital status, what family you belong to. Basically, everything about you would be worn on your sleeve. The skill of weaving and cloth making were highly respected in Egyptian culture. In fact, in their mythology, there were quite a few supposed deities that were connected to fabrics, clothing, and weaving. This shows us how prominent and respected cloth was in Egyptian culture. While the societal rules of dress are fascinating, I found the lack of certain rules interesting as well. Ancient Egyptians were one of the first ancient cultures to view women as equals, and they were not very strict about gender-specific attire, especially in the lower classes. It was very common for men and women to wear similar clothing, hairstyles, and makeup. Nudity was also common in Egyptian culture, partially due to the extremely warm climate. While sex and sensuality have always influenced fashion, for Egyptians, nudity was a social norm and was not as taboo as it is today. Children would be naked until puberty, after which they would wear clothing and makeup just like any other adult. Slaves would also usually be naked, and many of the working class, both men and women, only wore clothing on the bottom half of their bodies. Even the upper class wore garments that were either partially or completely see-through. And our final question before we begin looking at specific garments is, what were the materials used to make clothing? Most all clothing originated from either linen, spun from the flax plant, or papyrus. Flax was ideal for cloth because it grew in abundance by the Nile River, and it was reasonably easy to spin, weave, and sew into linen garments. Linen also provided excellent protection from the oppressive sun and heat of the region while keeping the wearer cool. Other materials derived from animal fibers or skins were sometimes used in winter garments or shocking fashion statements. However, most of these materials, especially wool, were considered unclean and impure, and were forbidden to be worn in sacred areas like temples. It is possible that their repugnance towards wool came from the fact that it would usually never be washed, or possibly it was the fact that wool was rather irritating and itchy on bare skin. Fabrics like silk and cotton would not be used until the latter part of ancient Egypt's history, as Greece and Rome began to have more and more influence over the country. So now we know a little history about ancient Egypt, the cultural mindset toward clothing, and the materials used to make them. Let's now take a look at the designs and styles of ancient Egyptian garments, starting at the head and working our way down. Most of the time, Egyptians would be completely shaven to keep clean, and priests would shave their whole body to show their purity and devotion. That's right, folks, shaving is not a new concept. People have been doing it for thousands of years. Most men, women, and children would be completely bald. Royal children would have a long section of hair called the side lock of youth or Horus lock, which would be shaven off when they became an adult. Several tools could be used to maintain hygiene and to style their hair. These are ornately carved ivory hair combs and hair pins. They used sharp pieces of bronze to shave with, and to see their reflection, they used polished bronze mirrors. Wigs were used to replace natural hair, and were woven with a combination of human hair and plant fibers. Some would be woven with gold, or colored unique colors like red or dark blue. For special occasions, both men and women could adorn their wigs with headbands, beads, and top their wigs with a kefi. Kefis were concoctions of incense that could be burned, used for medicine, or worn on the top of the head. Most were derived from the essence of lilies, myrrh, cinnamon, henna, cardamom, or cassia, just to name a few. By mixing animal fat and the incense together, a cone could be formed and then attached to the person's wig. The idea was that as time went by, these fat cones would slowly melt, and as it melted, the fragrance would be released and the oil would condition the wig. Now, you may be asking, what about headdresses? Most everyone has seen the sarcophagus of King Tutankhamun and his famous gold and blue headdress. That sarcophagus has sort of set a specific image of Egyptian fashion in people's minds, mostly because it was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. However, from my research, I could not find any depictions of commoners wearing fancy headdresses, only deities, priests, and royalty. The only headdresses I could find for common people were very basic plain skull caps and linen head wraps. Headdresses were rather special. They were a symbol of opulence and importance, and they were used to set certain figures apart from the common people. There were many types of crowns from various regions of Egypt and were used for different official purposes. Sometimes a king would mix several styles together to create their own unique crown, and most supposed deities had their own specific crown to distinguish one from another. Some of the most important crowns were the atef. The atef came from Upper Egypt and featured curled ostrich feathers, one on each side of an elongated white crown. A symbol of the underworld, the feathers represented truth and justice, and the atef was mostly used for religious ceremonies. The 𝓟𝓪𝓬𝓲𝓪. The 𝓟𝓪𝓬 was a red crown from Lower Egypt that was woven like a basket with possibly reeds or flax. It symbolized the pharaoh's authority over Lower Egypt, which was considered a lawless land of disorder. A 𝓟𝓪𝓰 has never actually been found in archaeological digs. However, they were frequently depicted in reliefs and statues. The 𝓟𝓪𝓬. The 𝓟𝓪𝓬 was a white crown from Upper Egypt. Like the 𝓟𝓪𝓰, a physical crown has never been found, and our references are from depictions alone. Unfortunately, not much is known about this crown. We are not even really sure what materials were used to create it. It has been speculated that both these crowns were passed on from one king to the next until the crown was no longer usable. When Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt unified, the 𝓟𝓪𝓰 and 𝓟𝓪𝓬 came together as well, forming the 𝓮𝑒𝑛𝑡, a red and white crown featuring a uraeus. A uraeus was a head ornament with the form of a rearing cobra on the front. It was for the pharaoh alone and was another symbol of divine authority. The 𝓮𝑒𝑛𝑡 was worn by pharaohs from the early days of Egypt all the way to the last Greek rulers before the fall to Rome. The 𝓮𝑝𝑟𝑒𝑠. The 𝓮𝑝𝑟𝑒𝑠 was a blue crown from the New Kingdom. It was also known as the war crown and was probably made of a stiff leather or fabric. Covering this were sequins or discs, and it featured a uraeus on the front. And finally, that headdress that you see on King Tutankhamun's sarcophagus, well, it was called a nemes. It is technically not a crown in and of itself, but it still represented the pharaoh's power when paired with the uraeus. The nemes was made of a starched linen and had two large flaps which hung behind the ears and down over the shoulders. Everyone wore makeup in ancient Egypt. Unlike today, makeup was not just for cosmetic purposes. It protected the ancient Egyptian skin from the damaging effects of the sun and hot climate, while also helping to prevent disease. Coal, a mixture of ground galena, sulfur, and animal fat, was used as eyeliner. Coal was applied with either the fingers or with a stick made from wood or ivory. Blue, green, and gray powders from ground-up minerals were used as eyeshadows. Reds to color the face and lips were derived from red ochre. Henna could also be used to dye wigs, skin, and nails. Ancient Egyptian men did on occasion grow facial hair, mostly on their chins, and sometimes it would be braided with gold thread or dyed with henna. Over the years, facial hair would oscillate in and out of popularity. Metal false beards were also a thing, and they were pretty much an exclusive accessory for pharaohs, be they male or female. Now, moving away from the head, we will be working our way down to the body garments. Egyptian men either wore a loincloth or a kilt-like garment called a shenty. Women wore a long linen garment called a calisiris. The distinction between the upper and lower classes throughout all kingdoms depended on the length and quality of fabric. Wealthy Egyptians were able to afford the highest quality linen, which at times would be so finely made that you could see right through it, while the middle and lower classes would wear rougher linen or wool. During the Old Kingdom, shanties were a very simple knee-length garment, which was belted or tucked and tied at the waist. The sewing of garments was very basic at this time, and most everything was tied and strategically wrapped to stay on the body. Men and women of the lower and working classes were topless and wore pretty much the same simple kilt. Sometimes they would wrap this kilt around through the legs to provide protection while working or warmth in the colder months. Upper-class women wore a long, tightly wrapped piece of linen that reached to the ankle. This was either held in place by straps that tied behind the neck over the shoulders, or simply wrapped and tied it under the bust. Both styles left the chest pretty much uncovered. Some dresses were comprised solely of beads, as seen here. Most of the beads used were made of colored glass, shells, or pottery, and could be worn over a linen dress or worn alone. Some of the first bead dresses were found during excavations in the 1920s. It is fascinating to see the impact and influence of Egyptian fashion even centuries later. From the 1920s to the 1970s and even today. During the Middle Kingdom, things began to change, and sewing and ornamentation began to develop as well. Clothing styles from the Old Kingdom did not completely disappear. Many people still wore the same styles well into the Middle and even New Kingdom. The changes here were more like additions rather than complete replacements. Shanties became pleated and gathered in the front, and the length became longer, going all the way below the knee. This new style was paired with a starched triangular apron, which was held up by an elaborate belt and was decorated with ornaments that hung down in the front. These aprons, combined with the pleated shanties, would create a dramatic shape by sticking straight out in the front. Sometimes this combination would be worn alone or worn with a tunic or shawl. Middle Kingdom calasiris were fairly similar to the Old Kingdom calasiris. However, sleeves were beginning to be introduced, and they were a little looser on the body. The garment could start at the neck or below the bust, and the length was still at the ankle. It could be draped over one shoulder or both, or worn with shoulder straps. Embroidery and dyeing of fabrics was still pretty rare, and most garments were still white. Then we have the New Kingdom, which was definitely the most ornate, flamboyant, and heavily ornamented of all the kingdoms. It is the era Egyptologists know the most about because so many real items have been found, including underwear, winter boots, tunics, aprons, socks, capes, crowns, jewelry, and even gloves. By now, there was much more of a separation between men's fashion and women's fashion, and fewer women were walking around bare-chested. This was a prosperous time, and even the middle and working classes were enjoying more elaborate apparel. Men's fashion in this era featured much more fabric, with big fluffy petticoats and tunic blouses with sleeves. Some of their garments were see-through, and the length varied from over the knee to ankle length. As we see here, the silhouette of women's fashion had changed too, with more fabric and longer, looser gowns featuring full sleeves. As you may recall from earlier, animal products were considered unclean. There was, however, one exception called a padellide. A padellide was a leopard or lion skin shawl only for royalty and priests. These were often documented and they would be quite striking, sometimes embellished with jewels. Lions' tails were also used as belts, but these were mostly worn by the pharaohs as a symbol of power and strength. Since clothing was usually a plain white or cream color, jewelry would be used to add color and details to outfits. Everyone wore jewelry, and when they died, it would be buried with them. The quality of jewelry depended on wealth and status, but even the relatively poor wore some sort of jewelry. This was where a lot of symbolism could be incorporated into fashion. The animals, materials, and colors used in each piece was specific and symbolized things like rebirth and the afterlife, or were used in an attempt to invoke prosperity, protection, fertility, healing, or happiness. Animals like vultures, cats, cobras, hawks, falcons, and scarab beetles were frequently used. The primary metals used to make jewelry were gold, copper, and tin. Polychrome glass beads added interesting, bright colors, as did gemstones like emeralds, malachite, jasper, garnet, tiger's eye, amethyst, turquoise, obsidian, carnelian, lapis, quartz, and pearls. Middle and lower class jewelry would have been made from more humble materials like rocks, bones, teeth, shells, pottery, or imitation gemstones. Now, what type of jewelry did the ancient Egyptians have? Simply put, everything. They loved all kinds of jewelry and wore it all over their bodies. Everything from bracelets, sometimes multiple bracelets stacked on top of each other, earrings, wide necklace pieces, long dangling amulets, ankle bracelets, armbands, and rings. Signet rings were engraved with special markings and symbols that would be unique to the individual wearer. These rings would serve as identification and could be used as a means of signing their signature to documents. Finally, we have footwear. During the Old and Middle Kingdom periods, most people went barefoot, no matter what class they were. During the New Kingdom, however, sandals became the favored form of footwear. For special occasions, the upper class had sandals, slippers, and for cold winter months, leather boots. The lower class only had rags or went barefoot all year long. Sandals could be made with wood, leather, or papyrus. Priests were required to wear only papyrus sandals. Sometimes sandals would be adorned with beautiful fine jewels or engraved with gold images. Egypt had a monumental impact on the world, and at one point they were considered the rulers of the civilized world. Their culture, architecture, and fashion have influenced history, and they still are having an influence on us today. I hope that you learned valuable information today, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching.